Papers have now been graded. If you are a student who submitted yours to me, there's a possibility that there might still be a slight delay. But if you submitted your paper to me, I accepted it, no changes, and you should have a grade. And you should also receive a rubric that identifies the breakdown for each category. It's just a straightforward rubric that captures the different dimensions of the criteria that I gave you before you turned in your papers. And so you'll want to look closely at that rubric and pay attention to what you did well and where you could improve, because it'll help you to write a stronger paper next time. But if you turned in your paper, I accepted it. And the mean grade was about a B minus. And for the most part, the papers were strong and we're happy with the papers. We would like you to, of course, continue to put in hard work in the class, and the research design is your next opportunity to do that. But I would like you to think a lot about how you did on that response paper and where you could improve. That's going to be the best place to focus on your effort as you prepare the final writing assignment. Our goal with that rubric is to just communicate with you clearly what you did well and where you could improve. And so it's a very straightforward kind of, objective rubric that captures the different components of the assignment. Now, if there are no questions about that, we will pick up where we left off, and we are discussing rights and liberties. And in some ways, this discussion, it almost is taken for granted because we think about rights and liberties as really being the foundation. Freedom is the foundation. Without the freedom or the right to vote, for instance, is democracy even conceivable? Not really. In many ways, these rights and liberties create the basis for democratic life. At the same time, we don't think a lot about what we mean by rights. And it's a really important question because when our rights are violated, we need to be in a position to demand that they be rectified. We need to be able to tell in the first place that they are. And one of the trickiest questions in institutional analysis more generally is identifying the institution and conceiving of it in a way that is concrete and systematic. And so what we're going to do today is we're going to treat rights and liberties like the institutions that they are, and we will talk about the different dimensions of rights as institutions or as things that structure our behavior and that create incentives or reward certain types of behavior. We'll talk about how they fit into democracy, and more generally, we'll try to move in the direction of a conversation about what rights are especially essential, and then maybe whether the most essential rights of all have been curtailed more recently and especially rigorously in recent months. We'll talk about the right to vote, especially, and how restrictions on the right to vote imperil both the right and the ability to practice that right to vote. And more generally, then, our discussion is about the right to vote and about these rights and liberties and how they become essential to democracy. So our starting point is really a very basic one. And what I thought it would be useful is engaging in kind of a philosophical analysis of rights in talking about what we mean by rights and where they come from, what is a right and what is not a right, what distinguishes, say, a right from a privilege, and when the practice of a given right is imperiled and how that affects whether we can say we have the right. And in particular, the right to vote will loom large in our discussion because we'll use this as sort of the the key critical right. We can't conceive of democratic life without the right to vote or without the vote. And so this is going to really organize our discussion. So the first element in the three elements that make up rights is entitlement. Now, this is a loaded term because in the US context, it's been highly politicized and certain connotations have been attached to it that it does not deserve. But an entitlement, in a basic philosophical sort of sense, is something that is owed to us. We have a claim to it. We have some legitimate, undisputed, taken for granted claim to something. It's not a debate. It's not a fight that's being waged. There may be fights, but it is owed to us and we are entitled to it. The example of the right to vote is really important. It's not just a desirable action. It's not just something that makes the wheels go round. It's something that we have. It's in the Constitution. It is owed to us. We are entitled to it. And so this is super important because it's different than, say, oh, the ability to celebrate new holidays. That's not an entitlement. We may want to have that right, but we don't have any claim to that because there's no constitutional basis or other basis really for that. Now, you might make a strong case or make some argument that you should have that right, but that's a separate issue. The right to vote is something that we have and it is indisputable. It's in the Constitution. Now, there are, of course, many things that are not rights. And so, for example, you don't have a right to celebrate new holidays. You might want to, and maybe advance a claim on your employer that you should have a day off to celebrate a new holiday. I would support you. But it would be disputed, and there would be a conflict about whether you have that. And maybe ultimately, you might lose because we don't have that right. You can disagree, but let's consider some examples that are closer to home and that make sense in our context. Lecture notes. It's a privilege. It's not a right. I give you the lecture notes. I record the lectures. I upload it as soon as I can because I want to make them available to you. And I believe that you do benefit from having them. But I don't believe that you have a right to those lecture notes. Back when I was in college, you didn't get the lecture notes. And this actually wasn't that long ago, but it's not a right. It's a privilege, right? Okay. So what about maybe with regard to the public chat in a Zoom meeting for class? Use of the public chat is not a right. Maybe a privilege that is granted to you, but it's not a right. You do have a right to use your voice and to speak up and to share your opinion or your perspective. And you can do that using the mic or speaking to me via the chat. But using the public chat itself is a privilege that can be granted to you or it can be taken away if, for example, people begin abusing the privilege or spamming the chat or mocking classmates or mocking things that I say. In that case, you certainly could lose the privilege. It is your right to be treated fairly without regard for any characteristic. And so more generally, you can't be fired for becoming pregnant, or, well, unfortunately, there are still places where you can be fired for being gay, or gender nonconforming, or whatever characteristic has not yet been protected by virtue of the creation of law. But it is your right to be treated fairly without regard for any of these characteristics, because there's something higher than statutory law. There's human rights, and there's a claim to rights that we have by virtue of being human. But in our immediate context, the right to vote, for instance, is something that is owed to you. It is an entitlement. It is not a privilege. But as an entitlement, as something that you are owed, you also have a means of rectifying it or addressing a grievance if it is violated. And so this is where other institutions come into consideration. Our rights and liberties don't function in isolation. They depend on a system or the capacity of other institutions to protect or to redress grievances or wrongs that have been committed against us. So rectitude is the second element. And if your right is denied, you have been wronged. And so, for example, if you are arrested and you're not read your rights and you're taken in, that's a violation of your Miranda rights. In which case you would say, my Miranda rights were violated, and it would change the process. It's essential that your rights are protected and that rectitude is part of the equation. How many examples are there of cops who don't read Miranda rights and cases get thrown out because they arrest people and that simple thing doesn't take place? It's an example of rectitude. But notice that so much of this relies on a strong rule of law, right? In the capacity of courts to function independently and to enforce the law and to protect individuals over institutions. And so what happens if you don't have rule of law or a strong judiciary or a capable set of state and judicial institutions? Well, you could have a very different outcome and you wouldn't have the same protection, and rectitude would mean virtually nothing. And so you can see then why rights and liberties depend on rule of law. And the reading that we did from Beetham does talk at length about how rule of law forms really the basis for the functioning of rights and liberties and the protection of them, and then the redress of grievances when those rights are denied. And so if your rights are taken away, you say my rights have been violated. And the system is supposed to be set up, it's supposed to function in such a way as to redress that grievance. Rectitude is the second element of rights. Now, the third element is the exercise component. And this is the part that seems especially fraught with politics as of late. And we're going to address the question of whether voter ID laws and voter suppression tactics constitute efforts to prevent the exercise of the right to vote. And I encourage anyone and everyone to prepare for that discussion, because we can use it as an example of the issues at stake and why the three elements are essential for rights to really be said to be intact and to be real and to be exercisable. We can't say that we have a right if it's not something that we can truly exercise and practice. And this is the third component. This is the exercise of component. We have to have the right. That is to say, it has to be something that is on the books, right? That there is a basis for, and we have to be able to use it. We have to both possess the right and literally, in practice, be able to use it, employ it. You cannot speak of a right that can never be realistically exercised. You could say, oh, you have a right to become you know, the president of Egypt. Everyone has the same opportunity to do that. Not really, right? You can say that, but really that's not actually true. The point is that if you inhibit the practice or the exercise of a right and prevent people from exercising a basic right, the right doesn't exist. It has to be able to be used. And so the right to vote, if you're denied access to the polls in any number of ways, or if your vote is not counted, then you don't have the right to vote. It's kind of like if your arm is broken, but you don't have the money or can afford the private insurance to get it fixed or get a sling, you're not really free. You're not free from poor health or a broken arm. In the same way that if you have the right to vote but can't exercise it, you don't actually have the right to vote. Now, this is where it gets dicey because there's a lot of disagreement about, well, what inhibits or what constitutes an obstacle to exercising a right and what doesn't constitute an obstacle. And the discussion and the debate is intensely political and is tied up with the fate and the prospects of a variety of political actors who would be affected differently by enfranchising more or enfranchising fewer voters. And so this is why rights are both concerns of individuals and political concerns that have to do with all of us. So the rights of people to vote affect all of us. This is why it's both political and something that affects and has to do with the dignity of any individual person. So rights and liberties are a special kind of institution because they are experienced on the individual level, but they also are political, and they're deeply political in that they become an important object of contention in a democracy. And on that, we're going to begin to address a deeper question. And the one question that I wonder if is on your mind, and as we talk about this issue of rights and the right to vote in particular, and the three elements of the right, you must have and be able to exercise and rectify any violation of your right. And so the question for us has to do with various efforts to suppress the vote or legal changes that add additional requirements to voting. And so I picked out one example, voter ID laws. And the question is, do these voter ID laws infringe on the right to vote for certain groups? Now, without going in any direction, I just wanted to share the UN Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, which in Article 25 says, every citizen shall have the right to vote and to be elected at genuine periodic elections, which shall be universal, and equal suffrage shall be held by secret ballot, guaranteeing the free expression of the will of the electors. That's what the UN Covenant on Civil and Political Rights says regarding the right to vote. And at this point, I'd like to ask anyone who wants to comment to make a comment, but I do plan to show you a video here in a moment that will bring this into focus a little bit more. But before I do, what do you think? Do voter ID laws infringe on the right to vote for certain groups? And please raise your hand so that I can determine who speaks first. Yes, Hope.
My biggest concern with voter ID laws would be for homeless and poor citizens because if they don't have the money to get a voter ID, then they wouldn't be able to vote. Therefore, the right to vote is not equal amongst all citizens.
Yeah, absolutely. There are groups who don't have IDs, and a lot of people don't have IDs, by the way. A lot of people don't have a driver license. People who live in like the city, like New York City, they don't often have a reason to drive. And so my wife grew up in Brooklyn, and if you grow up in the city, you don't drive a lot. And so maybe you don't have an immediate reason to get a driver license, for instance. And if you're living in Brooklyn, you're not getting a hunter safety license, right? But I'm just giving you an example of the various ways that such a rule would affect citizens and groups differently. And it's well known that, in particular, Black Americans, a sizable proportion don't have IDs, in addition to elderly people, but also homeless people, disabled people as well. Anyone who doesn't drive a car or who doesn't work or is in a situation that wouldn't require having an ID, these people are less likely to have an ID. And so then there becomes a genuine and important question about how those voter ID laws would affect those groups differently. And if it affects the exercise of the right, then it becomes a serious question whether the laws are tenable and whether they are consistent with the rights and liberties that we associate with democracy. Efren says, I would say that for most groups, it does infringe the right to vote because it can be assumed that a certain group cannot be trusted. Also, it sets up racial discrimination because as of now, there's certain groups that have low turnout rates, and this voter ID law would diminish political participation. Yeah, very well reasoned, Efren. And that's the important point. And so the important point is they affect groups differently. And so a common retort is, I have an ID. What's the problem? Anyone can get an ID, but that's not the point. And not just anyone can. It costs money to get an ID. So it's actually just it's difficult to sustain. Jeffrey, do you want to make a comment?
Yeah, when it comes to the voter ID laws, I do not see them as a disenfranchisement, only because well, first of all, I was doing my own research. I wasn't looking either to the right or to the left, part of the political aisle, and it came to my knowledge that voter ID laws are not disenfranchisement, and people have actually interviewed Black Americans when it comes to voter ID laws, and they asked them multiple questions, as in, do you mind if would you mind if they would ask you for your ID?
But
Do
that's
you even
not
have an
that's
ID?
not what determines
And
whether or not it's voter disenfranchisement. That's irrelevant. The fact is
well,
that hear me out. The fact is different groups don't have the same access or ability to get an ID. And
well, it's kind of
if you're hear me out, if your ability to vote depends on getting an ID, that does become a source of disenfranchisement. Asking individual voters if they have an ID or could get one is a separate issue. The question isn't can you get one? They might be able to get one and it could be quite costly to get one, right? So it's not even actually relevant whether they can get one or not. It has to do with the relative burden and the relative difficulty and the obstacles that it generates when you require them to have an ID. Samantha,
Well, I wasn't even done talking.
Do you want to go, Jeffrey? I'll let you.
go ahead, Jeffrey.
I'll let Samantha go first.
No, I'd like to hear your response.
Oh, okay. Basically, I was gonna say that that just because one is required to have an ID, that's not actually disenfranchising or suppression at all. And
I still
then
haven't
I
heard a
also
single
looked up
argument about how or why that's the case. You
well,
just keep saying
also
it's not disenfranchisement.
well, it's not disenfranchising,
Why?
and it's interesting because the Washington Post has also touched on this and
But
gave
why?
President Joe Biden four
Why
Pinocchios.
isn't it disenfranchisement? You haven't made an argument.
Well, it's not disenfranchising only because you're only requiring an ID. Anyone can pull an ID to the voting poll, and it does not actually hinder people from voting. And the
You're,
Washington
but
Post and multiple,
you're not
the
making
Washington,
you're not making an argument. Okay,
the
so
Wash, the Washington,
I'm gonna let Samantha speak. Okay, go ahead, Samantha.
So if I'm not wrong, it does say that to vote, everything has to be free and federal. So am I wrong in assuming that if voter, like requiring a voter ID, wouldn't that mean that getting your ID has to be free federally? If they're not presenting that to be, like you said, it does cost money for it. There's requirements. So you have to put like an address, and like not everyone has an address, Like
Yeah.
I understand that, PO boxes exist, but like even then, like there's plenty of homeless people that have the right to vote, and just because they can't get like a proper PO box or something like that, that shouldn't be an excuse for them not to vote. And that's just, in addition to that, if it's like you said, it does cost money. So wouldn't it just be smart to make no fines to get an ID? Like it should just be, you can come in, you can make one, and then wouldn't it be easier to just get that ID law? Like you said, the problem isn't necessarily the ID itself. It's that it costs money, that it has requirements that not everyone can have. So if you take off that, like, oh, we can give you a PO box right here, and we can give you this for free, would that not be, sort of a compromise?
Yeah, I
Can I
understand.
talk to Sam real quick?
Yes. So we're gonna go Max and then Michael Medina. Okay, so Max first.
Right. So Sam, I just want to kind of, if I understand Sam right, it's saying that we have the right to vote, but we don't have the right to an ID. So if required that we need an ID, that inherently infringes on our right to vote because we are not inherently given the right to have an ID in the first place.
Okay.
Yeah,
Go ahead, Sam.
I
Sorry.
agree. No, I see where you're going, and like, yes, I agree. Why?
Okay, Michael, do you want to comment?
Yes, I was trying to say early on is that it creates an extra tier. Whereas like there's like tier 1 and then tier 2, because if you're requiring voter ID, that creates another tier. And the problem is that the transition between tier 1 and tier 2 is why it creates disenfranchisement, because you're basically filtering out a certain type of group or people or persons, as well as I think it was one of the other classmates mentioned about like ID in general. And in my election class, we learned that it's not, I'm not trying to say this, but like a politician, it's their duty to make the other party be their voters to be disenfranchised and to encourage their own voter. Like they want more votes for them.
Yeah. So there's a lot here, and what we would hope for is that political actors try to beat the opposition by mobilizing their voters and by broadening the radius of their political support and their voter coalition, rather than by restricting or reducing or or literally purging the voters of the other side. And
Yeah. Oh, sorry. Can I mention one more thing?
yes, Michael.
That's also we also learned this in my election class where we learned about like you mentioned purging voters. They also talk about like they always like to keep the what's it called they like to refresh or clean up the voter registration. And some states do it where it's like every couple of elections. But if someone like, let's say I don't want to vote for the next 3 or 4 elections, but then the 5th election that comes around, I want to vote. But if I'm wiped out, then I have to re-register. And that can be considered purging my vote.
Absolutely. And I think that the key point here is that, and let me actually respond to something that Samantha said. Theoretically, you could just give everyone an ID. But I also think that would also be in some sense, that would sort of limit the right to vote. And because what you're doing is you're creating an additional layer, right? An additional checkpoint that people just have to meet, regardless of whether it's free. You're making them go above and beyond what they were supposed to have to do to just participate or vote. And you're making them do something that's irrelevant, frankly. Like, why do we have to get an ID? Well, the main reason is because the party in power wants to make it so fewer people vote, because when more people vote, it helps them, or when fewer people then vote, it helps them. And so, yeah, I think that voter ID laws, if I can be frank with you, I think that voter ID laws are an abomination and a complete farce and a waste of time and a deliberate effort to disenfranchise people. And even if it's not tantamount to saying, oh, you can't vote, it doesn't have to be. It's effective disenfranchisement when you create barriers to voting that involve new expense or the obtaining of some sort of document or documentation or establishing your status. These are all just a distraction, and it's designed to prevent people from voting, and that's the frustrating thing about it. So Jeffrey, go ahead. Why do these voter ID laws not disenfranchise voters?
There's also a link that I also sent to you
no,
so that you could also check.
Tell us.
So, no, that's for later on. So you could also see that that especially Joe Biden has also exaggerated it.
We want to hear
But
from you,
just
your perspective.
basically,
Not
voter
about
ID laws do not disenfranchise voters simply because you're just required an ID. That's basic. Like, people have exaggerated it, compared it to Jim Crow, as in like the poll taxes, and many liberals have compared it to back in the Jim Crow era. But you're just required of a voter ID. Matter of fact,
But what if
Georgia,
you can't get an
not
ID?
many, but that's actually racist to say that Black people cannot access to it.
But
Many
what if you
Black
can't
voters
get an
have
ID?
increased in Georgia. Professor, if you read the statistics, if you have actually seen people and have actually seen people discuss with actual Black people in New York, Georgia, it is racist to basically say that Black people cannot access to it.
Can you address
They have
the
access
question on
to
the
it.
merits?
They have access to the actual
Don't
ID.
use
They
fallacious
have
reasoning.
access.
No, don't use fallacious reasoning. What if they can't access an ID? Literally.
But they do have access to an ID.
No, what if they can't? Not everyone can access an ID.
Sir, but it's you're basically saying that they just can't. They do have.
No,
They
I'm
can
not.
access.
I'm not making a comment about the agency or capacity of anyone. You're distracting from the point. You're addressing
No, but they can.
No, I'm
They
asking.
can access to it simply
No,
because.
what if they can't? What if they can't access an ID?
Well, the statistics show that they can, and that's what I'm looking at, the statistics. And actually, more New Yorkers that are Black have actually access to these IDs. They know where the DMV is. They know how to access to it. They know how to access to the internet, how to get the ID in the first place. And they have actually turned out actually.
Okay, so they have transportation to the DMV. They have the internet. They have the
Yeah,
knowledge and the skills to acquire all.
yeah,
these
they can. It's
can?
just it's pretty racist to say that they can't.
Oh, so
And
What the hell are you talking, Jeffrey? If somebody cannot get an ID, how does that not infringe? Forget about black people. Forget about statistics. This isn't statistics. This isn't
Well,
statistics.
actually,
No, Jeffrey. No. Answer the question. If somebody does not have the access to get an ID, what the hell are they supposed to do?
well, depending on what areas are you talking about. Are we talking about, for example, Georgia?
Answer the
A
question.
lot of people
If
have. A
somebody,
lot of people.
if somebody can't get an ID, how the hell do they vote?
Well,
Don't give me
first of
statistics. Answer the question. Answer the question. Answer the question.
Depending on the area.
What if they do?
Depending
What
on
if
the
they
area,
cannot?
Max. Depending on the area. If we're talking about
Bullshit, the
Georgia,
area, Jeffrey. It's
if we're
not a
talking
hard
about
question.
Georgia, well, first of all, we have to talk about where these voters' ID laws are actually being
Okay,
placed. For
listen,
example, like
listen. Jeffrey, the issue that people have is that you're not addressing the question. You're distracting from the real issue at hand, and the real issue at hand has not been addressed. And we can move on, and we will. I apologize to those of you who found this distressing. These are important issues that we need to address, and I think that what this conversation highlights is that there's serious disagreement about what the relevant issues are, and maybe about what kinds of obstacles exist. But I think that it's important for us to be honest about some of the real obstacles that do exist and that prevent people from voting, and maybe accomplishing the simple acts that we may take for granted, but that have become part of the expectation. Listen, I'd like us to step back and calm down and kind of recoup. And in order to do that, let's take a look at a video that interprets some of the long lines in the US in recent months after the most recent election, and talks about this in a way that is more contextually rich and discusses some of the issues that we've begun to wrestle with. But thank you for being here, everyone, and engaging with this conversation. Do sit back and try to take from this what you can. I want to remind you that one of the advantages of political science is that we get to have public discourse, and we get to engage and discuss issues that matter a great deal. But that means that we're going to have differences of opinion in a conflict of views on many occasions. But that's not a reason to shy away from discourse. It's a reason to engage with it more deeply. And so we'll have more chances to do that. But I'd like us to, at this point, just sort of step back and sort of absorb what we can from this footage, and then we'll hopefully have a richer point of view.
When Joseph Johnson went to vote in his first presidential election, this isn't what he expected.
The line went this way in front of our auditorium and then snaked around into our library.
The last person at his polling location didn't get to vote until 1 a.m.
It was the longest line that I've ever waited in my entire life. Some people, they were just like, well, screw it.
This was in a heavily Democratic part of Houston, Texas, and it was a primary election where Democrats and Republicans were voting on separate machines. But the county had given both parties the same number of machines to use. Also, Texas had closed hundreds of polling locations in recent years, meaning more people had to vote at fewer places. But not everyone has to wait. This is a map of all the polling locations in Josephs County that had reports of long lines. And here's the percentage of non-white voters in each area. Notice how most places with lines were in less white areas? The poll closures and the other decisions that led to those lines disproportionately affected people of color. And whether or not that was intentional, those kinds of decisions in places like Texas used to be highly regulated and much less frequent. Today, that oversight is gone, but the 2020 election could decide whether it comes back. This is the Edmund Pettus Bridge in Selma, Alabama. In 1965, a group of civil rights activists, including the future Congressman John Lewis, marched across the bridge and were attacked and beaten by police. They were marching for voting rights. Back then, especially in the segregated South, there was rampant voter suppression of Black Americans. It started back when the 15th Amendment granted Black men the right to vote in 1870. That right was enforced by federal troops who occupied the southern states during a period known as Reconstruction.
But what happened after Reconstruction was that the states passed a number of laws that effectively disenfranchised African Americans.
Of course, no law could say no Black people can vote. It had to be a little sneakier, like the grandfather clause, where you could only vote if your grandfather could vote, which is impossible if your grandfather was a slave. There were literacy tests where voters, mostly Black voters, had to answer bizarre questions before they were allowed to vote.
Not just tests to see whether or not you could read, but things like, could you recite the state's constitution?
And poll taxes, requiring voters, again, mostly Black voters, to pay to be allowed to vote.
It selectively chose who had to abide by these rules.
In the 1950s and 60s, Congress passed several civil rights laws that attempted to protect voting rights, getting rid of things like poll taxes. Still, by 1964, in Mississippi, barely 7% of non-white Americans could vote. Selma's Bloody Sunday drew attention to that. It made Americans and Congress wonder if local officials like these guys could really be entrusted to enforce these new civil rights laws. So Congress wrote another one. 10 days after Selma, the Voting Rights Act of 1965 was introduced. It added additional protections, got rid of literacy tests, but it also had a way to prevent any other creative changes.
State governments had to submit their changes to the federal government for approval.
The Voting Rights Act identified parts of the country that had a history of voter discrimination, mostly in the South, and set up federal oversight. So if these places wanted to change anything about voting, like enacting a new law or closing polling locations, it first had to get the okay from the US Justice Department or federal courts that it wasn't discriminatory. Immediately, non-white voter registration in these southern states grew, like in Mississippi, where it went from barely 7% to almost 60% in just 3 years. The Voting Rights Act did what earlier civil rights laws hadn't. But in 2013, the Supreme Court, with a majority of Republican-appointed judges, took on a case about the Voting Rights Act. They decided that the way the law calculated which states would have that federal oversight was outdated and therefore unconstitutional.
No one doubts that there is still voting discrimination in the South and in the rest of the country. We do, however, find that the coverage formula in Section 4 violates the Constitution.
Almost immediately, voting laws that had been previously denied for being discriminatory were enacted in these states. Literally the same day as the Supreme Court's decision, Texas did just that, announcing a voter ID law that a federal judge had previously rejected because it was the most stringent in the country and imposed strict, unforgiving burdens on the poor. Other states enacted voter ID laws too, along with other measures that had been previously stopped, like purging voter rolls and closing polling locations. 1,173 places in total, 750 just in Texas. An analysis by The Guardian looked at the 50 Texas counties that gained the most Black and Hispanic residents from 2012 to 2018, and the 50 Texas counties that gained the fewest Black and Hispanic residents. In these counties, the combined population fell by 13,000 over that time, and 34 of their polling places were closed. In these counties, the combined population grew by 2.5 million people, but 542 of their polling places closed. Many officials in these states say changes like these aren't intended to disenfranchise specific voters, but there's no way to really know. What we do know is that almost all these states' governments are controlled by Republicans, and the groups that tend to be disenfranchised by these changes are more often poor people and people of color, most of whom tend to vote Democratic.
Even when they're saying it's not, it's very hard to believe that, in fact, they didn't have a strategic discussion about how they could minimize the Democratic Party's vote.
In the Supreme Court decision, the Chief Justice told Congress it's okay to have oversight, just don't base it on old data.
Congress must ensure that the legislation it passes speaks to current conditions.
And so in 2019, the House of Representatives did just that, passing a new bill to update the criteria for which states get federal oversight. John Lewis, then a congressman in his 17th term, presided over the vote. But the bill passed almost entirely along party lines. Almost no Republicans voted for it, and nearly every Democrat did. Then the bill moved to the Republican-held Senate, where it isn't going to get a vote. And even if it does pass the Senate, the Trump White House has threatened to veto it, arguing the oversight is unnecessary. But the House, Senate, and White House are all up for grabs in the 2020 election. And this is one of the many areas the two presidential candidates have polar opposite views.
Pass the bill to restore the Voting Rights Act. It's one of the first things I'll do as president if elected.
In 2020, John Lewis died. The bill whose passage he presided over was renamed in his memory. If the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act becomes law, its formula would restore federal oversight for several states, including Texas.
It's like if there are no rules to the game, then no one can really play the game.
Thanks for watching this episode of our...
All right, everybody, there you have it. As you can see, this is not just an academic exercise. We're engaged in a discussion that is very real and very political and affects all of us. So thank you for being a part of it. Hope, would you like to make a comment before we leave?
Do you think that disenfranchisement is kind of like a given in the situations of the two-party system? I forgot who said it, but someone said that candidates will try to disenfranchise the other candidates' voters. And when there's like a two-party system, of course, there's going to be people that are always going to be left out of like the conversation and voting rights. Do you think that's like a given, or what is your opinion on that?
Well, I don't know if it has to do with the two-party system. I think it might have more to do with the majoritarian electoral system and the incentives that it creates. And well, I think that electoral competition rewards all kinds of behavior. So parties do try to minimize the vote of their rivals. Gerrymandering is a problem in a lot of places, and it's a problem in majoritarian electoral systems. Is it as much of a problem in proportional representation systems? I don't know. I actually can't say. But I don't know if the two-party system is really the culprit, so to speak. I think it's actually probably more fundamental than that. But you know, certainly the two parties lock into place a system that does reward minimizing the other party's vote, and so that doesn't help for sure. All right, everybody, have a good one, and have a lovely weekend. I'll see you on Monday.